So in this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayero, in the very first Pasuk, we learn about the importance and the centrality of Gemilus Chasodim Begufoi, those mitzvahs sheben Odom lachaveiroi that are so central and so fundamental in Yiddishkeit. Vayero Elav Hashem be'eloinei mamrei v'hu yoshev pesach u'oyel kechoim hayoim. The very first Rashi, Levaker es hachoilo. And that's in Bava Metzia Daf Pevov Amud Beis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to visit Avraham, Biker Choilem. And if Avraham is so sick, why is he sitting bepesach ha'oil? He should be in his bedroom. Chazal teach us, he is sitting bepesach ha'oil looking for guests. Hachnosas oirchem. And Kodesh Baruch Hu sends him guests. He sees 3 Arabs, 3 malachim, 3 angels from above. And Chazal teach us, Gedoylo achnosas oirchem yoisem mekabolas p'nei shchina. Kivi Yochel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to visit Avraham, but Avraham, Kivi Yochel, leaves HaKadosh Baruch Hu and is engaged in achnosas oirchem. So achnosas oirchem we learn from Avraham Avinu, Bikei Cholim we learn from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And both these mitzvahs are defined by the Rambam, Perek Yud Alad Aloch Aleph Melchas Ovel, Gemilus Chasodim Begufoi. Many times he spoke about this concept. The Rambam writes, these mitzvahs are medivrei soifrim. But in that very same halacha, the Rambam writes, they were all included in v'yohavtu l'reachu kamoicha. V'yohavtu l'reachu kamoicha is a mitzvah d'oraisa. So how does the Rambam write that these are mitzvahs that are bonon? The understanding is a very simple one. When you are engaged in achnosas oirchem, in biker cholim, lavoyes ameis, l'sameach chosim v'kala, you're mekayim v'yohavtu l'reachu kamoicha. If you abstain from these maisim, you're not mevatel a mitzvah d'oraisa. You are mevatel a mitzvah d'rabbanan. Because the mitzvah d'oraisa v'yahavtu l'reachu kamoicha, you still could be mekayim in 1,000 other ways. There are 1,000 ways to love a fellow Jew and to express your love and appreciation and your compassion. Each and every one of them is a manifestation of v'yahavtu l'reachu kamoicha. But Chazal were metaken, you need to be engaged in these specific endeavors. Biker choilem, hachnosas orchem, levoyes ameis, simchas chosim v'kala. So they are mitzvahs that are bonon, but they're all included in the fundamental great mitzvah v'yahavtu l'reachu kamoicha zeh klal gadol b'Torah, specifically dealing with our sugya, because the Shiur today is Biker choilem. Specifically dealing with Biker Cholim, there's another Gemara in the Dorm Daf Lamed Tes, Menayin, Remez leBiker Cholim, Min haTorah Menayim, Im Kemois Kol Odom Tamusun. So Chazal bring an additional Remez, specifically for Biker Cholim. And in other sources in Chazal, Gemara Midrashim, we find additional Ramazim. But those are all Remez. Fundamentally, these are mitzvahs, Gemilus Chasodim Begufoi, and as the Rambam explains, mitzvahs medivrei soifrim, but they are included in v'yahavtu l'reachu kamoicha. And that is why they have special importance and special significance and special chumrah. In Sukkah Daf Chof Hei Omed Aleph, we learn that misham she'hachoila p'tura min ha'sukkah. The choila potter min ha'sukkah because of teishvu ken taduru. Why are misham she'hachoila p'turim min ha'sukkah? All people that help him out, that take care of him. Most Rishonim maintain, oisig b'mitzvah potam and a mitzvah. However, the Bialoch and Siman Beis, quoting the Pri Megadim, is mesupek whether an oisig b'mitzvah derabanan is potam and a mitzvah. L'chayr it's a gemor meforeshes. The Rambam says, Biker cholim is mederabanan, v'yafal pikein, p'turim and asukah, mishim she'oisig b'mitzvah potam and a mitzvah. According to what I just explained, it's not really a kasha, because, yes, there are mitzvahs that are bonon, aval ikran min haTorah. When you help the ill, when you oisek and Biker cholim, you are mekayim a mitzvah d'oraisa, so it should be no wonder that by Biker cholim we do find oisek b'mitzvah poto min ha-mitzvah. What is the essence of mitzvahs Bikur Cholim? What is it about? The Tur, Yoredei Shin Lamed Hey, writes two things, two fundamental concepts and ideas. Tefillah. When you see a person in pain, you are nisoira to pray for him, to daven for him. So Bikur Cholim is about davening for a choila. But every day people give us names and we daven for them. It's not the same, it's different. When you see a person's pain, a person's suffering, it touches your heart. It's different. Your davening will be different if it is a person when you witness his pain and suffering. So the Torah explains, it's about tefillah and also about caring for a chayla, making him happy. See and ask and inquire, how could I be helpful? These fundamentals are in Teres Odom from the Ramban. The Torah is matik, but the Ramban is the one that explains Bikur Cholim is about tefillah, it's about davening, and it is also about caring, doing your best to be helpful. But it is uncommon that people come for Bikur Cholim and they daven. We actually wouldn't want everybody that comes for Bikur Cholim should take out a Tillim and start going through the entire Sefer Tehillim. You don't necessarily need to daven in the presence of the Cholim. The idea is when you visit a Cholim, and once again, as I just explained, and you witness his pain and suffering, then you will daven. Doesn't necessarily need to be in his presence. And even if you do daven in his presence, you don't need to daven out loud. Don't make an issue out of it. But it is about tefillah. So if a person is mavakes a choil and he didn't daven for him, the Torah writes, he wasn't makayim the mitzvah, definitely not b'shleimus. I think essentially, you're makayim the mitzvah Bikur Cholim even at the end of the day you didn't daven. Or you weren't helpful. Then Ramban and the Torah merely mean to explain what is the essence of the mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to emulate his deeds? So to Daf Yudalad, Achrei Hashem Elokechem telechun, v'chiyef shel alecha sacharav halech b'midoisav, mahu mevakeh choilem, afata beko choilem, mahu choinen dalem, afata choinoin dalem. So in this week's parsha, the very first pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to visit Avram, and he expects us to do the same. And why is that? One is the benefit the ill will derive. One is the benefit they will get out of Bikur Cholim. Twofold. We'll daven for them and we'll care for them. But not the davening and caring is ma'akev in the mitzvah. The mitzvah is kepashtusoi, levaker es ha-cholim. But the mitzvah min ha-muvchar, and the essence of the mitzvah is not just to come visit, but to see what you could do to be helpful and to daven for the choila. Why do I say it's not really ma'akev? There's an interesting discussion. I didn't see this discussion on Poskim, but two fascinating sources, both are in this week's parsha. Not halachic sources, but nevertheless very important sources because they are Rabbi Seinu Harishonim v'Gedolei HaPoskim. We have Perush HaRosh ala Torah, and that is a new Ksav Yad, which wasn't known to our predecessors, to the Achroinim. Perush HaRosh ala Torah, in this week's parsha, the Rosh says, if you visit a person and he's sleeping, he isn't aware, he doesn't see you, you still were Makayim, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And why is that? Because his family will tell him when he wakes up that you were here, and it'll make him happy. So what we learn from this Rosh is there's a third objective in Bikur Cholim, just making him happy, making him see that people care for him. We share his pain. We think about him. So the Rosh says he was sleeping, he didn't see you, but you still were Makayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim because his family will let him know. If the family doesn't know you and they just come in and out, maybe you're still Makayim the mitzvah. His family will tell him that someone was here. He'll try to guess who that someone was. So But what boils down to, I think, what the Rosh means to say, in any event, if you come to visit a choile, that in itself is the mitzvah of Bikur Choile, regardless of what happens later. But the mitzvah min hamuvchar, and the essence of the mitzvah, and I explained in various different shuvas that I wrote, when we perform mitzvahs, lachatchila, we need to perform mitzvahs in a way to achieve the essence of the mitzvah, the objective of the mitzvah. Even though you're yoytze Bikur Cholim, you just came in and out, and you say, gave him a bracha, you're mekayim the mitzvah. But if you really want to do the right thing, number one, you need to daven for him. Number two, inquire, ask. So most of the time, nothing is required. If a person is surrounded with a loving family, especially if he's a man of affluence and influence, he will be taken care of. But you should ask, you should inquire. Maybe it's something, a very small thing. Maybe there's a sefer you could bring him, or even some food which would appeal to him. So the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is about davening. It's about caring for the Cholim. And what we learn from the Rosh, just make him happy. Just he sees that people care for him, people come to visit. That is also one of the goals, one of the objectives of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. The other source is Magid Mishorim. That's the fascinating sefer. The Torah of the Magid, the Malach that came to teach the Beis Yosef, and the Magid Shorim. In this week's parsha, the Magid teaches us, without words. So according to the Magid Mishorim, Bikur Cholim in a way is similar to Nicham Avelim. By Nicham Avelim, you speak Divrei Tanchumim, words of consolation. By Bikur Cholim, words of encouragement, words of chizuk, words to show that you care for him. And according to Chazal, you take one part of 60 of his sickness. So the Beis Yosef says, you need to talk. You need to give him divrei chizuk. According to the Rosh, I didn't say anything because he was sleeping, but I was still mekayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So I wrote about the question, two of the great Gedolim, present-day Gedolim, or actually previous generation, deal with the question, could you be mekayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim with a phone call? Igras Moshe, Yordei Chelek Aleph Simen, Reish Nun Gimel, Minchas Yitzchok Chelek Beis Simen Pei Daled. Reb Moshe says, it depends what the mitzvah is about. If it's about davening, then you could be mekayim with a phone call. If it's about caring, you could be mekayim with a phone call. If it's about making him happy just by visiting him, then maybe you're not mekayim with a phone call. I have a very clear feeling, which I expressed in various different shuvas. I am not totally convinced, and that's why I say more of a hargosha, more of a feeling, but I think mitzvahs shetiknu chachom and mitzvahs derabanan, we need to be mekayim in the very same fashion that chachomim were metaken. And not always do we say, zil bosar tami. Sometimes you could achieve the goal, the objective of the mitzvah, but you need to be mekayim the mitzvah in the very way Chazal were metaken. So in modern Hebrew, in modern Ivrit, levaker means to visit. In Lashon Kodesh and in the Lashon of Chazal, levaker means to check, to examine. Korban Tzibur needs to be examined 4 days before we could bring it to the Mizbeach. And at these 4 days, every day, we need to check whether there is no mum, whether there is no blemish. And that is called Daled Yemei Bikur. Bikoires Tihiyeh. Levaker is to examine, to check. So everybody thinks Bikur Cholim means you need to come to visit. So how could you be mekayim with a telephone? Bikur Cholim doesn't necessarily mean you need to come. You need to check him out. But I still say, Pashtus HaMitzvah is to come. Because 2,000 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 500 years ago, it is only when you came to visit a person that you could really achieve the goal of Bikur Cholim. But maybe not. I'll find his brother in shul. I'll find his father. I'll find his mother. I'll find his children. I could ask them what his name is, whether they need something. The Tur in Shin Lamed Hey writes, and that's the Tur I quoted a few minutes ago. It's about davening, it's about caring. But the Lashon of the Tur is Mitoich Shiroi Ehu. When you see him, you feel his pain. So the Lashon of the Tur is Mitoich Shiroi Ehu. When you're Mekayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, you see him. And that is Pashtus HaMitzvah. And therefore, Shleimus HaMitzvah, Mitzvah Min HaMuvchar, you need to come to see him. However, when that isn't possible, you still Mekayim the mitzvah in a way, maybe not the Mitzvah Min HaMuvchar, if you call, especially if you see him and he sees you by Zoom or other means. You still didn't come to visit, but in a way you're Mekayim the Tur Mitoich Shiro Eho. You're seeing him. So let me just make my opinion clear. L'chatchila, you should come to visit. It means that much more to him if he sees you care for him enough to take the time off and to come to see him. But if it's impossible, sometimes we want to be mavakachol, a person that is in another land, in a different place, in a distant place, and it's just not feasible to come personally. It still is a mitzvah. Give him a call, let him see you, at least talk to him on the phone. You're still Mekayim a mitzvah, because let us not forget, I quoted before, that Rambam explains, what is Bikur Cholim about? It's Gemilas Chasodim Begufay. Essentially, it's Gemilas Chasodim. So, a phone call is Gemilas Chasodim, a Zoom conversation is Gemilas Chasodim. So the mitzvah min hamuvchar is come to visit. Care enough about other people. Come to visit, but if you can't, for any reason, you still should phone and you still show him and his family that you care for him and ask how you could be helpful. And even when you speak to a person on the phone, in a way, you are more personally involved, and it will enhance your davening, your prayers for the Cholim. And this brings us to a very fundamental question, because recently, almost in every Shiur, in an indirect way or in a direct way, I touch upon COVID-19, this very special period. We're still in the midst of this pandemic. Is there a mitzvah of Bikur Cholim to visit patients with COVID-19? Or other patients that are ill with infectious diseases that are contagious? So I said many times we need to uphold regulations, but let's put aside the regulations for a moment and deal by pure halachic perspective. Is there a mitzvah of Bikur Cholim when you are putting yourself at risk that you might be infected? Especially COVID-19 is extremely contagious. We know almost of no other disease that is so easy to catch, so difficult to prevent. It is very contagious. So theoretically, you could come visit a person. Don't touch anything, sit 3 meters apart. He's going to wear a mask, you're going to wear a mask. But when you come to visit the ill, you can't impose on them to wear a mask, and sometimes it's difficult for people that are sick, especially if they have COVID-19 and they have difficulty breathing. So, would there be a mitzvah of Bikur Cholim where you're putting yourself at risk? There's an amazing Tshuvas HaRamah, and I have a very unique interpretation of the Ramah. But before we discuss Tshuvas HaRamah that deals directly with this question, what are we dealing with? What are the relevant sugyas? 2 sugyas. One from the Gemara, and the other one is not a sugya in the Gemara, but rather a posuk in Koheles, Perek Ches, posuk Hey, and in the Poskim. And it's somewhat of a mystery. 4 different sources in Shas we learn, Shluchei mitzvah einam nezoiken. People that are engaged in a mitzvah would know no harm. Shluchim mitzvah ein nezoikin, in chronological order. Psachim daf ches u'med beis, Yuma Yud Aleph u'med Aleph, Kedushin Lametes u'med beis, and Chulin Kuf Mem beis u'med Aleph. At the end of Masechet Chulin, the very last paragraph, the very last Tikkel Gemara. What are the sugyas dealing with? Psachim daf ches. A Jew lives right next to a non-Jew, and there's only a wall, a partition separating their homes, and there's a hole in the bottom of the wall. Do you need to do b'dikas chametz in that hole? For two reasons, the Gemara is mesupik. Do we need to do b'dikas chametz? There might be a scorpion there, or a venomous snake. The other chashash is the non-Jew living on the other side of the wall. He's going to see you with a candle. He's going to think you're doing kishuf. You're engaged in sorcery. And he might hurt you for that. You might be afraid that you're out to get him. So the Gemara says, Shlicho mitzvah ein nezoikin. However, kavia hezeika nizoikin. Now, the Gemara in Psachim actually says, Shchiche hezeika nizoikin. This brings us to Yom Yud Aleph Omed Aleph. Masa ba'artavon shehoya magia mezuzas b'shikol elyon. And one of the inspectors, the non-Jewish inspector, caught him red-handed, and he gave him a knas, and he gave him a penalty. And the Gemara asks, Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin. The Gemara says the same. Kvia hezeika. They were out to get us, those inspectors. And kvia hezeika, we cannot rely on Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin. Both in Kedushin and Chulin, Chazal tell this tragic story of a person that was climbing a ladder to be makayim the mitzvah of shiluach heken. And regarding the mitzvah of shiluach heken, the pasuk says, "Laman yarichun yamecho," and he fell off the ladder, broke his neck, and he died. And the Gemara asks, "Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin." Elisha ben Avuya, also known as Acher, the Rebbe of Reb Meir, saw this tragic event, and it turned him off. And the Gemara says, "Laman yarichun yamecha, laman yutav lach, la'olam shekul yorach, la'olam shekul toiv." It means b'olam haba. But nevertheless, the Gemara still asks, "Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin." The Gemara answers, it wasn't a good ladder. It was a flimsy ladder. Kvia hezeika nizoikin. So in a tshuva I wrote, I discussed Kvia hezeika and Shchicha hezeika. Are they the same or not? L'chora, they're the same. I don't see any difference between the three different cases, the three different sugyas, b'dikas chametz, hagoas mezuzas, falling off a ladder. Why does the Gemara lose two different lashonas, Kvia hezeika, Shchicha hezeika? I don't know. There are things I don't know. Adayin tzorech yun. But as much as I thought of it, I don't see a svara to be machalak between the different cases. They are all incidental. So when we try to define what is Shchicha hezeika, we cannot put it into percentage points. It's impossible to define what are the chances you're going to fall off a flimsy ladder. Depends whether you weigh 35 kilos or 200 kilos. It depends whether you're a small, skinny person or a sumo wrestler, weighing 150, 200 kilos. And it depends what the ladder looks like. How broken is it? What are the chances that the guy on the other side of the wall would think you're trying to harm him? How could one say? If he's a good neighbor, is he a bad neighbor? Is he a believer? Is he superstitious? How could we say? I think Kvia hezeika and Shchicha hezeika means reasonable risk. How could we go beyond that? So that's one sugya, Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin. So there's a pasuk in Shlit Perek Ches, Shomer mitzvah lo yeida davaro. It's interesting. In all the sugyas I quoted, Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin, why don't Chazal quote the pasuk Shomer mitzvah lo yeida davaro? The Gemara doesn't quote any pasuk. L'chayre, it's mashma that the assumption Shlucha mitzvah ein nezoikin is a svara. It's not something Chazal based on a pasuk in Torah Moshe, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Ma'oimik binosom, uberuach kodshom. Chazal say, shluche mitzvah eino nezoiken. The mitzvah is megan. They don't quote the posuk shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro. My feeling would be, we do find the Gemara quoting that posuk. Shabbos Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. Kol makayem mitzvah kimamora ein mevasren oisoi psurois rois. Kol makayem mitzvah kimamura ein mevasren oisoi psurois rois. It's very unclear. What does that mean? L'choire, it's a zgula bi'alma. He will hear no bad besurais. And if that is the interpretation of Chazal, that doesn't necessarily mean that you could rely on schus mitzvah to keep you away from harm or damage or pain or chas v'sholom, death. Ein mevaser noisei besurais rois. It's very unclear. What does that mean? But the fact is that all these sugyas don't quote that pasuk. They just assume and determine shluchim mitzvah in a zoik. So it's a gewaldige chiddush to me that the poskim, in a very well-known question, don't quote the Gemara shluchim mitzvah in a zoik, but rather shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro. What is that question? Yibum bikatlanis. Yevamach Samach Daled, we learn a woman that was married 2 times according to Rebbe, 3 times according to Reb Shimon Gamliel, and both of her husbands died, sudden death, inexplicable. Then she is a katlanis, she should not marry a 3rd time or a 4th time. Historically, poskim were very makel by chashash katlanis, but that's not our sugya today. So the poskim deal with the question, mitzvahs yibum bikatlanis. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah which he could be makayim only with her, unlike priya or reviya. The Ralbach, 500 years ago, I think is the first dealing with this question, mitzvahs yibum bikatlanis. Chuvas Ralbach, Semelamed Vav. After the Ralbach, Rabbi Elio Mizrochi, Chelak Aleph Semachov Beis, Noid biyuda madura kam Even Ezer simen Yud, and all of them quote the posuk shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro. The Chacham Tzvi Chelak Aleph Simen Aleph disagrees, and he says it's an Isser Gomer. Why? Shchicha Ezeka, we cannot rely. So just like the Gemara says, B'shchicha Ezeka, we cannot rely on shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin, Chacham Tzvi says the same regarding shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro. But why don't all these poskim quote a Gemara, 4 sugyas in Shas, shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin, and they quote a pasuk which, according to Chazal's interpretation, Shabbos Taf Samach Gimel seems just to be a general musar, a general zgula, ein mevasa noisa besurais rois. I think trying to define and differentiate between the 2 concepts, shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin is only b'shas kiyum ha-mitzvah. All 4 sources, Chazal wonder how could it be they were harmed, their life was in jeopardy, b'shas kiyum ha-mitzvah. He fell off the ladder. He was engaged in shiluach haken. He was in the middle of Magia Mezuzis, and he was caught and penalized. B'shas kiyum ha-mitzvah, we have the Haftocha, shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin. By katlanis, the danger is not b'shas biyah. The danger is at some stage he might die. And that is why Chazal don't base it on shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin. Shluchim mitzvah ein ezoikin is b'shas kiyum ha-mitzvah. Why doesn't the Gemara bring shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro? So if not the Ralbach and the Mizrahi and all those gedolim, I would say shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro is not reliable. It doesn't give you protection. It's just as gula, he will not hear b'seiras ra'os. But I'm trying to explain the Ralbach and the gedolim going back hundreds of years, gedol ha-poskim shemapiyam anochayim. And my feeling is this. Shoyme mitzvah leyeda davaro means you will not be harmed by the mitzvah. Kiyum ha-mitzvah will cause you no harm. So Yibum Bekatlanis, the Chashash is Bia. You cannot be harmed by a mitzvah. But if you climb a ladder, you're not being harmed by Shiluach HaKen. You're putting your life in jeopardy by climbing a flimsy ladder. Sticking your hand into a hole, you're putting a life in jeopardy. There might be a scorpion. You might have a bad name that'll hurt you. So, Shomer Mitzvah Davaro means the mitzvah will cause no harm. But it doesn't mean that the mitzvah will protect you from external harm. And that is why the Gemara doesn't quote the Pasuk, and the Poskim don't quote the Gemara. So I think this is a magnificent idea to differentiate between two different concepts. Shomer Mitzvah L'Yedei Davaro and Shlucha Mitzvah Eina Nezoikim. Coming back to our sugya, both regarding Shlucha Mitzvah Eina Nezoikim, the Gemara says Shchicha Hezeika. We do not take that risk. We do not rely on Zgulas HaMitzvah. And the same regarding Shomer Mitzvah L'Yedei Davaro, like the Chacham Tzvi says, Shchicha Hezeika. I mentioned before, could we define Shchicha Hezeika? Could we quantify it? Could we put it into numbers? I don't think so. Because it's very individual. All the sugyas we find in Shas. How could we put it into numbers? And therefore, I definitely think when we're dealing with a disease which is extremely contagious, when we're dealing with a disease which is extremely contagious, I think that definitely would be defined as Shchicha Hezeika, and we should not take a risk. And therefore, I think there would be no mitzvah of Bikur Choilem when we are putting our lives at risk and coming into the domain, into the room of people that have a contagious infectious disease. I mentioned before, Tshuvas HaRamah, Siman Chaf. The Ramah actually deals with Din HaMomenes. But Derech Agav, he addresses the question of Bikur Choilem. Reuven rented out a room in his home to his friend Shimon and his wife. Shimon was married. Today, it's hard to imagine renting a room. We live in the age of plenty. But I remember when I was a youngster, even a younger man, summer, we used to rent rooms. We used to go up to Tzfas. A person had a big house and he rented out rooms. Reuven rented out a room to Shimon. Before Shimon moved in, they signed a contract. Shimon's wife fell ill with a Gelbsucht. What is Gelbsucht? We'll discuss that in a few minutes. Reuven wants to get out of the contract, and he said, I'm putting my family at risk, so I want to breach the contract. Shimon says, no, we have an agreement, and you need to uphold this agreement. It's a signed contract. Then Ramah was asked, who's right? I think, counterintuitive, that Ramah says, Reuven has no right to pull out of the contract. Shimon could move in. And what Reuven says, that he's afraid to be infected, hevelhu, that's nonsense. Those that want to breach a contract, they're looking for an alibi. Hashem hu ha-moichitz v'ha-roifei. Kodesh Baruch Hu is the one that watches over you, hu ha-moichitz v'ha-roifei. And then the Ramah goes on and he says, we do not find a difference by Bikur Choilem, this disease or that disease. So obviously you don't need to be afraid of getting infected from another person. We have a mitzvah of Bikur Choilem. Besides Ra'ason, because by Ra'ason, Chazal say, Lo Yeshev B'tziloi. So the Ramah says there is an exception, and that is Ra'ason. What's Ra'ason? Leprosy. For thousands of years we've known that this is extremely infectious. Today, this disease, Baruch Hashem, was practically eradicated. It is no longer with us. But in days of yore, tzaras, ras on leprosy tore families apart. And the lepers were sent away to live and to die. Even children were sent away. It was tragic. So the Ramah says, we don't find a difference by Bika Cholim, one disease or the other. So obviously you don't need to be choishish, you might be infected. Besides Rasan. V'oid. And the reason I'm stressing all these points, because soon we'll see it's a gewaldig enough gemina. The Ramah goes on and says, everyone is falling ill with this disease. Me'ipishu aver. The air is infected. The air is rotten. The air isn't good. So Reuven and his family, anywhere, are exposed to the disease. And if they are overly afraid, they should have put it as a clause in the contract. And if they didn't put it in the contract, they knew it's around, everybody is falling ill, machmas ipishu aver, then Reuven has no right to prevent Shimon from moving in. So many want to bring a raya from the Ramah that by Bika Cholim you don't need to be afraid of getting infected. Lani is daiti, that's not the right maskona. And I'll explain why. So the Ramah writes, Hashem hu ha-moichitz v'ha-roifei. You're just looking for an alibi. You're looking for a reason to breach a contract. It's hevel, it's nonsense. Is that so? So the first Godel was dealing with a question, when an epidemic strikes, infectious disease is in the air, do we just need to rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Hashem hu ha-moichitz v'ha-roifei, or we need to take every precaution? The very first source is the Maril, Simen Mem Aleph. After the Mel Chuvas Arashbash, the son of the Tashbitz, Reb Shloime ben Reb Shimon, ben Tzemach Duran. The Tashbitz, the Rashbash, Chuvas Arashbash, Kuf Tzadek Hey. They both were asked the same question, a philosophical question, Ashkofa question. Do we need to take precautions? Do we need to be careful? Do we need to try to go to the extreme to prevent the spread of disease, or do we rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Both explain clearly. We don't rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We need to follow the doctor's instructions, the medical establishment. We believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in control of everything. However, all our hishtadlus and health and parnosa is b'derech hateva. Rebbe Kiva ben Yosef, the greatest of the Tanoim, summed this idea up in 4 amazing words in Masechet Avos. Hakol tzafui v'hareshus nituno. Everything is predestined, predetermined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But permission was given to harm and to stay away from harm. I don't recall any other source in which the Rambam is nespoil and he expresses fascination and his palace. Persha Mishnah Masechet Avos, the Rambam writes, this is an amazing statement, fitting for the greatest of minds, Rebbe Kiva ben Yosef, Hakol tzafui v'hareshus nisuno. So both the Marila and the Tashbitz explain, it is Chazal that taught us on Bava Kamed of Samach, Dever be'ir kaneis raglecho. Lech ami, boi bechadorecho es gord losecho ba'adecho. We need to take every precaution and follow the rules that the doctors say. Is the Maril choylek on the Ramah? Does the Ramah disagree with the Maril? Definitely not, because he quotes the Maril. Yoredei Kuftet Zayin Sifei. The Maril in that very same tshuva writes, because we need to conduct our affairs b'derech hateva, based on science, based on medical experts. Therefore, when an epidemic strikes, we need to leave the city and run away. That was the belief, and those were the medical rules and instructions 700 years ago. Run away, go elsewhere. And the Ramah quotes the Maril Yoredei Kuftet Zayin Hey, so he definitely is not choylek on the Maril. Pele Yoyetz, one of the Sifri Yesod and Musa, going back hundreds of years, Be'erech Shemira, the Peretz Yoyetz writes, that was the Ashkofa, the philosophy and the belief of Yishmaelim HaTipshim. the Muslims believed. Rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you need to do nothing. Olam kimin hagei noyeg. Hayishma'elem atipshim. I'm just quoting the Lashon of the Pele Yoyetz. The Ramah definitely didn't hold the Ashkofa of the Yishma'elem atipshim. He quotes that very same tshuva in Maril. Tshuvas Maril Semem Memala, Frashbash Kuf Tzadikei. So how do we reconcile and understand the Ramah with the Maharil? Beyond that, Masarav, the Ramah did the same. We have a Sefer Mechir Yain on Megillas Esther, a great perush, a commentary of the Ramah on Megillas Esther. In the introduction to the Sefer, the Ramah writes, I am in Golus. We all left our city, Krakow, because of Ipushu Avion, because of an epidemic. We all ran away. Va'ani b'soich hagoyla be'eretz nochriya be'ir Shidlov. And that is where I'm writing this Sefer. So it's not only that Ramah quotes the Maril, he did the same. And that was Shin Tet Zayin. Let me share a piece of history with you, tragic history. Shin Yud Aleph, Shin Yud Gimel was the second wave of the bubonic plague, of the Black Death in Europe. In a period of 7 months, the Ramah lost his wife, his mother, and grandmother. The first to perish was his wife. She was 20 years old. The Ramah was a younger man. And that was Yud Gimel Sivan, Shin Yud Beis. Chav Zayin Sivan, 2 weeks later, his grandmother died, his father's mother, from the Magefa. 7 months later, his mother died from the Magefa. So the Ramah had first-hand experience what contagious disease is. Merely 4 years later, another Magefa struck, and people left town, including the Ramah. And he was sitting in Shidlov, not in Krakow. So the Ramah does not paskin, do nothing, rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how do we understand this tshuva? I want to make 2 points, very relevant points. What was the outbreak in Siman Chaf, the tshuva of the Ramah, Gelbsucht? I don't know what Gelbsucht is. I have a feeling it's jaundice, hepatitis. It has to do with gel, with tzahov, with yellow. So jaundice, tzahevet in Lashon Kodesh, is a group of conditions. There are 5 different strains of hepatitis, A, B, C. They are all infectious, some more, some less. Gelbsucht will also be jaundice, which is too much bilirubin. The question is, what causes that condition? We're all familiar with little babies that are too yellow and the bris is pushed off, is postponed. So Gelbsucht could be very contagious. It could be not contagious at all, or mildly contagious. So we don't know exactly what the Ramah was dealing with. On one hand, everybody had it. On the other hand, the Ramah says, you don't have to be choishish. Hevel, nonsense. We have a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. But the Ramah does say, by Ra'ason, no Bikkur Cholim, because we know it's contagious. So it's a mistake to assume that the Ramah says, mitzvahs Bikkur Cholim overrides sakana. No. He clearly says, dealing with leprosy, it's contagious, you need to keep away. Lo yeshiv b'tziloi, no Bikkur Cholim. So we understand the Ramah. The Ramah said, this is remote, it's mildly contagious. It doesn't override the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. In other words, it's not shchicha hezeika. It's not like ra'ason. And that is why you have a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. COVID-19 is like Ra'ason. It's extremely contagious. The other point I want to make is a very interesting one. In the same tshuva that Ramo writes, you're exposed to this illness anyway, even if nobody's going to be in your house. Ipishu avia. 700 years ago, the medical establishment believed that epidemics occur because there's something bad in the air. And that is why they said, run away, go elsewhere. The air in your town is awful. And that is how epidemics spread. Because people ran away and they went to distant cities and distant towns, and they brought the disease with them. A few hundred years passed. In the past 200 years, many Gedolim deal with how do we act in times of epidemics. They no longer recommend running away. Because by then, medicine knew that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's air is never rotten. It's never bad. To the contrary. When we're living in a Megefa, we want ventilation. Go out to the porch. Sit outside. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's air is never mu'upash, never mikulkal. So the Ramon, that very same tshuva, writes about Ipishu Aviyah. The Ramon in his introduction to Mechir Yain, when he writes, we ran away. Why did we run away? Why did we run away? Ipishu Aviyah. In Kuftet Zani Uradei, he speaks about Ipishu Aviyah. Only regarding Rason were they aware that people infect each other. Regarding other diseases, they weren't aware that it is people that infect each other, but rather the air is bad. And their understanding of Chazal, close the door. So air shouldn't come in. You shouldn't be affected by the bad outside air. So today we know it's not the air. Rebbe Kiva Eger, Reishis Bikurim, Zecher Yehoisef, Bialocha Kufn und Dalet Tzemach Tzedek Pischayolam. The past 200 years we no longer find run away. They knew that that is not the solution. Stay away from people, that's the solution. Tamtzis HaDevorim, there is no question that even the Ramah, dealing with COVID-19, would say, there is no mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. There is a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim, but not by visiting the people that are ill. You're Makayim the mitzvah with a phone, with Zoom, any other way. You could stay outside, and the person that has corona, if he feels well enough, could come to the window. He could actually see you, you see him. There's one hospital in Israel which is especially appealing and popular with COVID-19 patients and their families. I don't do promos for hospitals, so I won't mention the name. But they were so wise and smart. So the COVID-19 department is on ground floor. And people could be standing in the yard outside and seeing their loved ones, their family member from the window. And it means so much to them. Because one of the painful aspects of this disease is feeling isolated and being alone. We just try to imagine a person dying and no one is with them. I have heard from families that lost a family member and he was all alone. So Baruch Hashem, today there's more awareness. And some family members could be dressed up in protective gear and be with the ill. But it is still so impersonal. So the family's member is dressed up in white, almost looks like tachrichim, and with a shield and a mask. So it's tragic. So this hospital was so smart to have the department on ground floor. Almost all the rooms have a window to the outside, and he could see family members. So if you could visit a patient that has COVID-19 standing outside and he comes to the window, that's wonderful. But if not, you still have a mitzvah Bikkur Cholim, as I explained before. Not lechatchila, Not the best way, but you still have a mitzvah. Call him, see him, talk to him, and you're mekayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, in a way. So this is our discussion today. I think it's a fascinating sugya. First, we just spoke about the fundamentals of mitzvahs Bikur Cholim, and then we addressed a most pressing and relevant question, Bikur Cholim, for patients that have corona, also known as COVID-19. So with this week's parsha that we see the importance of Gemilas Chasodim Begufoi. Kiyam Avrom Avinu kol ha-Torah kula ad shelo nitno. Avrom was mekayim kol ha-Torah kula. And he understood all the Taryag mitzvahs beruach kodshoy. Even mitzvahs that Rabbanan, the Gemara says, even Eruv Tavshilin. And that's at the end of Masechet Kedushin and in Yomid of Chav Ches. But who are the Talmidim of Avraham Avinu? Who are his real followers, real disciples, real Hasidim? Kol sheyesh bo ayin toivo, ruach namucha, nefesh shfelo, midos toivos. That's the fundament. Those are the fundamentals. As great as Avraham Avinu was, Kiyam Avraham Avinu kol ha-Torah kula ad shelo nitno. Asora Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu va'omed bekulam. Last week we discussed the Asora Nisyonis. But his greatest achievement, who are his Talmidim? Midos. The Zohar teaches us, Shloishes ha'avos, the great three giants, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yankov, Avoseinu ha'gedoshim, are keneged Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasodim. I think everybody could guess. Actually, not guess, but rather figure it out. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yankov, who takes Torah, who takes Avodah, who takes Gemilas Chasodim? Clear as daylight, Avraham is Chesed. Do you know what is defined as Briso Shel Avraham Avinu? Everyone knows. Ois Bris Kodesh. Chosum bebriso Shel Avraham Avinu. However, in Ksubas Daf Ches, there's a new interpretation of Briso Shel Avraham Avinu. Beberchas Avelem. Hamachzikim bevriso Shel Avraham Avinu, and Rashi explains Gemilus Chasodim. Because Avraham Avinu was Rosh Verishon Legoim Lechasodim. And we see the extremes he went to in mitzvahs Achnos Esorchem. Vayita Eshel. So, Avraham takes Chesed. What does Yitzchak take? Avodah. The ultimate sacrifice of Akedas Yitzchak. He stretched out his neck, willing to give his life for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Avraham takes Gemilas Chasodim, Yitzchak Avodah. What's left for Yankov? It's not only process of elimination. Ishtam Yoshev Oiholim. Yankov takes Torah. How interesting, it's the other way around, because Chazal say Torah Avodah Gemilas Chasodim. So why, when it comes to the Avos, it starts with Chesed, from there to Avodah, and Torah at the end? Maybe Torah is the most important, but Chesed is the most fundamental. And there's a difference. Chesed is the most fundamental. Reb Chaim Vital in Shara Kedusha writes, Midas Tovos aren't included in Taryag mitzvahs, not because they're less important. It is because they're more fundamental. Taryag mitzvahs is a huge skyscraper. But you cannot build a skyscraper unless you have extremely deep and sturdy foundations. The foundation is the midas. Shloisha Simonim yesh ba'umezu, the Gemara says in Yavam Esayin Tes, Rachmonim beishonim v'goyim lechasodim. And that is what we learn from Avraham Avinu and from this parsha. Bikur Cholim, Achnos Esorchem, Midas and Mitzvahs Shebeinodam Lachaveiroi. Yehi Ratzoin. Most of these questions I'm dealing with lately should become irrelevant, and they should be lahalocha v'lo lemaisa. Yehi Ratzon. Let's hope b'korov. And we should all understand the importance of caring, of compassion, of the mitzvah sheben adam l'chaveroi. Ish esre'eu yazoiro, ola ochav yoyim chazak, kol hamaracham al bris marach mamolo min hashamayim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu yarachem aleinu v'yishlach lanu Moshiach tzidkeinu b'mheiro v'yomeinu. Amen.